Mankind, in general, is fickle, hypocritical, and greedy. This man has been referred to as a devil, and his name has been identified with evil, deception, and cruelty. His works have been burned, banned, and censored because they were seen as too dangerous to read. He is also one of the most misunderstood thinkers in history. This is Niccolo Machiavelli, and today we're going to take a look at his controversial recommendations for rulers. And we will discover how sometimes being a good person and being a good leader are simply incompatible. At various points in this video, you might find yourself becoming offended or outraged at his suggestions, and that is absolutely fine. But I encourage you to stick it out to the end. Because, despite what you've been told, Machiavelli is not a manifestation of the Antichrist, but a deeply complex philosopher and politician who has a surprising amount to teach us about the nature of power, government, and when being moral can do far more harm than good. But why should we listen to this guy, and who even is he? These are excellent questions, and so let's take a brief look at what has made Machiavelli a household name in political philosophy, and the experiences which shaped his ideas. But if you're concerned about how politics and power affect your newsfeed, then I recommend today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how the left and right-wing publications differed on the recent reports that the US economy grew by an annual rate of 2.3% in the last quarter of 2024. While the right was enthusiastic, emphasizing how consumer spending had risen considerably, left-wing sources were much less optimistic, suggesting growth is likely to slow in the first quarter of 2025. I especially like the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This field helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing the accusations that the Chicago mayor has mishandled gifts, or right-wing sources not covering the fallout from Trump's temporary freeze of a large amount of public spending. I don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So Ground News is fantastic for giving me an idea of the differences in reporting on different stories, so that I can get a variety of views rather than just remaining stuck in my echo chamber. Ground News is very kindly giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, so please do check it out. I think Ground News is doing very important work, and I'm very happy to have them as a sponsor. Anyway, back to the video. 1. Machiavelli, a political life. Niccolo di Bernardo de Machiavelli, born in 1469 in Florence, Italy, was a man of many talents. He was, at times, a playwright, a diplomat, a historian, and a lover of the ancient world. He is also one of the most influential political thinkers of all time. Given such a rich life, I can't possibly cover it all here, so I'll give a sort of potted biography as is relevant to the works we'll be looking at today. The Machiavelli family was an old one, originating in Giogoli just outside of Florence. Machiavelli's parents were not extraordinarily wealthy and went through periods of serious financial hardship. Nonetheless, his father, Bernardo, was an avid reader, displaying particular enthusiasm for ancient Greek and Roman works like that of Cicero and Aristotle, a trait that he would come to share with his son. Bernardo insisted on providing Niccolo with an intensive education, schooling him in Latin and the classics, as befitted an Italian gentleman. Niccolo read the ancient Roman historian Titus Livy's History of Rome in his early years, and Machiavelli's discourses on Livy would later become one of his most important works. During his education, Niccolo was also exposed to the much harsher elements of human nature, as one of his teachers, Paolo Sassi, abused the young Niccolo. along with many of his other students. Due to some very complicated political shenanigans involving a priest briefly taking over Florence and then being executed for it, Machiavelli ended up appointed the second chancellor to the Council of War and Diplomacy in 1498. This was his big break, and it catapulted him to a prominent position in the Florentine state. Over the course of the next few years, he would get a thorough instruction in matters of government. He would oversee military operations, become intimately involved in state bureaucracy, and even serve as a diplomat to the Kingdom of France. This experience in hands-on ruling would inform much of his later works. He saw periods of political chaos, success in war, and the best and worst of government advisors. It was also here he formed his famous opinion that you should either crush your enemies completely, ensuring that they never rise to bother you again, or invite them into the fold and make them your friends, but never choose the middle path and let them remain a threat. During his time in government, he witnessed how brutal statesmanship can sometimes really pay off. He observed the military and political career of one Cesare Borgia, who had a string of victories at his back and seemed poised to become the Caesar of Renaissance Italy. One of Machiavelli's first political works is directly about Borgia and his success in one of his campaigns, but he also saw Cesare Borgia fall from power, partly because of his own character flaws. Machiavelli's observations of Borgia are thought to have heavily influenced his infamous work, The Prince, which gave advice to absolute rulers on how they should run their states and maintain their power. It was also in his service to the Florentine Republic that he came to love and admire republican governance. This would remain a passion of Machiavelli's, and he served his republic faithfully and loyally. His deep respect for republicanism would inspire the Discourses of Livy, which is, in my opinion, his greatest book. This was an analysis of how republics rise, fall, and maintain their influence, as well as the many potential advantages they have over more authoritarian states. It drew upon the history of Rome, as well as many other nations, to demonstrate how republics truly could hold their own against the mighty kingdoms of Europe if only they were organized correctly and had skilled leaders at their helm. This work would later go on to influence Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau. Through this, it had a hand in the real-world rise of the European republics, and has arguably shaped how many governments in the West operate today, albeit in a pretty roundabout way. He was one of the first thinkers in early modern Europe to defend republics not just on some moral basis, but because they have the potential to work much more efficiently and effectively than autocratic states. However, this success was not to last. The old rulers of Florence, the Medici family, managed to seize control of the city again in 1512 to 1513, marking an end to the Republic and to Machiavelli's political career. He was captured, tortured, and exiled from the city, and it was in exile that he wrote his most famous works, including The Prince, The Discourses, and The Art of War, which was a detailed study into how to win wars or other armed conflicts. He openly bemoaned his fate, hating that he could no longer take part in his beloved Florence, and that it had fallen from a hopeful republic to a principality once more. Nonetheless, he also hoped to worm his way back into politics, and so wrote The Prince, addressed directly to the new ruler, Lorenzo de' Medici, to ingratiate himself with this regime. However, it would be many years before he found any luck there. Eventually, in 1520 or thereabouts, he was commissioned to write a history of Florence by the Medicis, which he completed over the course of a few years. We see Machiavelli's practical nature here. On the one hand, he was no fan of Medici rule, but on the other, he needed to paint them in a somewhat favorable light if he were to ever find favor in his home state again. His advice was also occasionally sought out by Medici family members during this period because of his renowned expertise in statecraft. Admirably, he often stuck to his guns in these sessions and recommended that they simply restore the old republic. These efforts to ingratiate himself with the Medicis did pay off a little bit, and in 1526, he was given an official position in Florence overseeing some of the city's defences. However, this was short-lived. The Medici were once again overthrown, and since Machiavelli had found some small inroad with them, he was denied a post in the new republic, and sadly, he died the following month. This new Florentine republic also did not last long, and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V would restore the Medicis to rule just a few years later. Machiavelli lived an incredibly varied existence. He saw the highs and lows of political power, touched upon every aspect of government, from foreign affairs to domestic matters to military strategy, and yet he also died with his key ambitions for a mighty Florentine republic and a unified Italy far from fulfilled. The circumstances of Machiavelli's writings raise an important difficulty when studying him. With the exception of the discourses on Livy, his major works tended to have highly mixed motivations, which make it difficult to assess just how much they reflect his private personal views. The Prince was partly a bid to return to Florentine political life under the Medicis, while the History of Florence was directly commissioned by that same family. And although it's clear that Machiavelli attempts to remain intellectually honest, it is also primarily a historical work and is not as outwardly argumentative as The Prince or the Discourses. The Art of War is also much more concerned with the minutiae of military planning than his other works, and it has far fewer broader ideas about politics. Thus, when comparing the different sources in this video, I will weigh what Machiavelli says in the Discourses higher than any of his other works. I'll also be drawing extensively from The Prince, especially when it's consistent with the advice he gives elsewhere. I'll be using the History of Florence and the Art of War a bit more sparingly, just because they're less explicitly relevant to his philosophical views. I wanted to open with this section on Machiavelli's life because I think it demonstrates two very important points. Firstly, Machiavelli is not an armchair theorist. His ideas are based on his many years of experience in government, as well as his extensive study of other political theorists and the histories of states like Rome, Sparta, France, and of course, his home city of Florence. And secondly, his life contextualizes some of his more vicious pragmatism. Having seen city-states, including his own, rise, fall, be conquered, and be liberated in his lifetime, this understandably colors his views on the world. Machiavelli does not just provide us with political theory, but political theory shaped by the most extreme and desperate of circumstances. In such a brutal situation, he truly thought you could not ignore what works and you could not argue with results. It is high-stakes philosophy, the best kind of philosophy. And with all of this out of the way, I want to begin with Machiavelli's views on human nature, because I think it provides the basis for much of his other thinking, and it is eminently practical for us, considering that we too are inescapably human. 2. Human Nature, a story in 2 parts. Since the dawn of civilization, we have been asking, what are humans like? On the face of it, this is such a wonderfully strange question because we all have first-hand experience of what it's like to be a human, so wouldn't we already know? Of course, the implicit framing of this question is normally, what are other people like? Or how can I expect the average human to behave, particularly with regards to me? Questions like this have been understandably criticized as pigeonholing what it means to be a person. There is so much rich variety between individual people that to give a complete theory of what everyone is like seems extremely ambitious. Critiques like this have only intensified in recent years as landmark psychological studies just fail to be replicated. And, considering the time period in which he lived, Machiavelli had an incredibly nuanced idea of human nature and human motivation that balances the needs of a political leader with recognizing how extraordinarily different people can be. On the one hand, Machiavelli shies away from creating a unified, universal view on human nature. This is evident both at the individual level and between societies. In The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, he talks about the varied temperaments between leaders. For example, he draws a distinction between warlike rulers like Romulus, the founder of Rome, and more administratively skilled leaders like his successor Numa. Rather than devoting himself to martial skill or territorial expansion, Numa focused on solidifying matters at home. He established the Roman state religion and instructed the populace in vital ways. Machiavelli also notes the important differences between both peoples and their cultures. For instance, he speaks very highly of early ancient Roman culture because he saw it as instilling virtue in its populace. On the whole, he thought the average man in the early to mid-ancient Roman period was reasonably brave, had a good sense of civic duty, and was willing to sacrifice some measure of personal benefit for the good of their community. On the other hand, he is much more cynical about the people of Western Europe in his own time, who he saw to basically be self-interested and unwise. Of course, this may just be the benefit of distance. He never had to actually see real ancient Romans behave in petty, vain, or selfish ways, so it's much easier to romanticize them. But his broader point still stands. There are huge differences between peoples, and so there is no way to definitively and finally say what mankind is like. Interestingly, he is also clear that more virtuous people are not the result of some innate advantage they had, but rather comes from the education given to them by the state. This is sometimes formal education, but more often than not is just the values that their culture promotes. He is not imagining early Rome as some perfect state filled with superhumans, and in fact, he cautions against this very thing. Instead, he thinks that they were products of their environment, and that if any ruler today wanted to replicate Rome's success, they ought to devote immense effort into educating their populace, not just in material facts, but also in virtues. So far, you'll notice that there's surprisingly little of our classic picture of Machiavelli. The idea that people can truly become more virtuous is not in keeping with the popular perception of this Florentine thinker as dastardly, deceptive, and brutally self-centered. A lot of this is just because the Machiavelli we have in popular culture is an absolute caricature of what the man actually thought. But it's also worth noting Machiavelli's more optimistic ideas about human nature and human potential contrast pretty heavily with how he thought that any real-world political strategist should view people in practice. Towards the beginning of the discourses, Machiavelli bemoans one crucial human propensity that thorns the side of almost any leader, and that is our ambition. In Machiavelli's view, almost everyone desires more than they have, and if left unchecked, this personal ambition will bring ruin to any state, no matter how initially prosperous or blessed by fortune it happens to be. He is not the only person to make this observation. Arthur Schopenhauer used to talk about how our desires are unquenchable, because as soon as we achieve one, another will surely rise to take its place. Hell, the very first story in the book of Genesis is about humans desiring more than they have, and Greco-Roman mythology is chock full of cautionary tales about excessive ambition. The destructive force of human avarice is very well known, but Machiavelli considers in detail how this should affect the running of a state. Although he does recognize that people can be made more virtuous and that this, in and of itself, can be a check on ambition, Machiavelli also consistently advises that the state should be set up as if almost all people are unavoidably avaricious, greedy, and power-hungry. The reasoning for this is pretty simple. While education can affect people's disposition and their behavior, there will always be some people that it just doesn't work for. There will always be some citizens in a state who will stop at nothing to achieve personal glory, no matter the cost. This is not necessarily a bad thing either. Great leaders, soldiers, and governors are often ambitious people, though Machiavelli does think that the best of them also recognizes limits on their own ambition. However, without proper enforced constraints, even a few motivated citizens can bring down a whole society. This is one way republics can collapse into tyrannies. For example, he thought the unchecked ambition of Julius Caesar led to the downfall of the Roman Republic, and so the degeneration of a free society into an unfree one. Thus, Machiavelli thinks a ruler should act as if their citizenry have little to no natural checks on their ambition. This will sometimes lead to behavior that seems unfair or out of balance. For example, an extremely successful military commander might be reassigned to a relatively obscure post so that any chance they would seize control of the state in a military coup is thwarted. Of course, this does mean that from time to time, a very able general who genuinely does not have designs on becoming a dictator will be mistreated. But Machiavelli thinks this is the lesser of two evils. When the stakes are so high, it is better to mete out a small injustice to an innocent party than allow a guilty one to run roughshod over an entire nation. And put a pin on this idea of the lesser of two evils, because it's going to become a bit of a theme in the video. I wanted to start here with this seemingly bifurcated view on human nature, as I think it's a good example of an overall trend in Machiavelli's writing. It can sometimes be helpful to think of Machiavelli as switching between two modes, almost as if he makes observations about two separate worlds. At one level, there is reality as it exists, with all its messy complexity. At points in his work, he outright emphasizes this complexity, saying that a skilled leader should disregard his rules if they have a strong enough contextual reason for doing so. But there is also the world of political action, where there is not always enough time to make these complicated distinctions, and where decisions often need to be made suddenly. And this is where his general rules and advice come into play. Although Machiavelli recognizes that not everyone has unlimited ambition, since he specifically praises rulers who manage to temper theirs, he thinks you will get a lot further by treating people as if they have unlimited ambition than as if they do not. I think this distinction is often made implicitly in Machiavelli's works. At one level, there is the world, and then there is something else. Let's call it political reality. This is the set of practical assumptions and axioms a skilled ruler often has to take as read to ensure their chances of survival and success. It's a bit like how a lot of engineers will set pi as equal to 3 in much of their work, because the difference between 3 and 3.14 and 3.14159265535 is just irrelevant for what they're designing. Sometimes, when Machiavelli appears overly pessimistic about the world or about humanity, he is talking at this level of political reality. For instance, as we shall see, while he prefers republics to principalities, he does not shy away from the way a prince must behave if they are to be successful and safeguard their state. And while he thinks that a people can become better with education, it is still best to assume the worst when crafting laws and writing constitutions. For every Cincinnatus who resigned his emergency absolute powers as soon as he had dealt with the crisis in front of him, there is a Caesar who was all too eager to make himself dictator for life when the opportunity arose. But this is just the start. While I think that Machiavelli's view on human behavior forms the foundation for the rest of his philosophy, the devil, as is so often, is in the details. And nowhere is this more evident than the way he views virtue. 3. Virtuous man, incompetent ruler. What would you say makes a good person? Of course, this question has occupied philosophers for thousands of years, but people also tend to settle on a few key properties. We tend to think that a good person is kind, generous, compassionate, honest, and principled. They are not hypocritical, they always stick to their word, and their heart is warm. If people thought someone like this was running for political office, they would probably vote for them. However, Machiavelli is significantly more skeptical. In his view, what makes someone a good person can also make them an absolutely awful ruler. And I think it's worth touching upon this point, because it makes the rest of his philosophy a lot more understandable. As pointed out by Erica Benner in her book Machiavelli's Ethics, it is too hasty to call Machiavelli an amoral political schemer with no respect for the common good or for notions of virtue or morality. In much of his writings, he largely criticizes acts he sees as harming the people of a city and praises those which help them. If he was merely concerned about the self-interest of rulers, then this doesn't make any sense. For example, in his History of Florence, he is very critical of Cosimo de' Medici for enriching himself and his own power at the cost of destabilizing the city and creating partisan divisions that were not nearly as extreme before his ascent. This course of action was undeniably good for Cosimo, but it was bad for Florence, and so Machiavelli is not a fan. In my view, and it is only my opinion, Machiavelli's ethical system is ultimately grounded on the consequences borne by the citizens of a state, and a ruler has a duty to those citizens. A good ruler is not one who benefits themselves, but one who benefits their people. Even in his most stereotypically Machiavellian book, The Prince, he still sticks to this reasoning, while also suggesting that it's in the prince's own best interest to benefit their people. For example, in one passage, he says the following: "The man who becomes king against the will of the majority and with the support of the wealthy nobles must make it an absolute priority to win over the affections of the common people. This will be easy if he takes them under his protection." And in the Discourses, he makes very similar statements where he praises republics for safeguarding the freedom of their citizens, stating that the wishes of ordinary people are far more noble than those of princes or kings because they tend to desire their own freedom rather than to dominate others. Working in the background is the implicit assumption that the good of the people in a city-state is the ultimate end goal. But then, why has Machiavelli got this reputation for enabling tyrants and praising dictators? Well, it is partly because he thinks that a good ruler and a good person require very different skills, and that we ignore this at our own peril. For example, in The Prince, he advises that a budding prince must sometimes be extremely cruel in order to both maintain their position and be a skillful and orderly ruler. This goes against a principal tenet of our intuitive morality, that compassion and kindness are unalloyed goods. But Machiavelli disagrees. This may be true in a private citizen, but a ruler doesn't just have to worry about themselves, they have a duty of care to their people. In one infamous section of The Prince, entitled Cruelty and Compassion, Whether It Is Better to Be Loved or Feared, Machiavelli says this: "A ruler mustn't worry about being labelled cruel when it's a question of keeping his subjects loyal and unified. He will prove more compassionate than the leader whose excessive compassion leads to public disorder." He then outlines how this excessive compassion can easily tip over into an inability to maintain order and public unity. This is a disaster for a city-state, as it will lead to their gradual weakening and eventually they'll probably be conquered by another state. Thus, the seemingly good thing to do has dire consequences, while the seemingly evil thing to do actually serves the people. As pointed out by John Whitcliffe, Machiavelli uses the word virtue sometimes to refer to straightforward moral good, but also to skill in ruling and skill in battle. To be a virtuous ruler for Machiavelli is often to be a skillful one who benefits the people of the state over and above any concern about one's personal conscience. And it's worth noting, this underlying concern for public good does also place limits on the brutality a prince or other ruler can enact. For instance, Machiavelli heavily cautions against seizing the property of citizens, as that is likely to sow chaos and discontent. He also suggests that rulers should avoid being hated at all costs, and this demands certain standards of ethical conduct from them. Not only is it in their best interests, it is also in the interests of the state they are governing, since their overthrow would invite a period of uncertainty where they may be conquered by another state, or an outright tyrant might seize control. In the Discourses, he is even more critical of tyrannical rulers, often saying that they limit the prosperity of their society. He argued that Athens flourished far less when it was ruled by the tyrant Pisistratus than when it was a democracy, and that rulers who enrich themselves at the cost of their people hobble both themselves and their state in the long term. So, I think it's important to consider the seemingly immoral recommendations in The Prince and the Discourses in light of this general theme. While both of these works sometimes do encourage a ruler or a republic to engage in dishonesty, cruelty, and barbarism, this is not a senseless celebration of brutality, but instead a reflection of Machiavelli's judgment that such surface-level immorality is sadly sometimes necessary for long-term prosperity. And while I think that he does tend towards letting the ends justify the means throughout his work, he is also pretty skeptical about suspending general moral rules all the time. He suggests that, in private practice, a ruler really ought to obey the laws of the land and the customs of whatever society they rule over. It is primarily when it comes to matters of state, and specifically when the good of the general populace is in the balance, that Machiavelli recommends these seemingly indefensible actions. And I think we can imagine the kind of person Machiavelli is implicitly critiquing here. It is the sort of leader who is concerned mainly with the colour of their soul and their personal moral code over that of public benefit. In modern politics, I've seen people level similar criticism at those who refuse to vote strategically in elections, preferring to favour a candidate which more closely aligns with their values but has no chance of winning, and as a result, making it less likely for the candidate perceived as the lesser of two evils to prevail. And look, there's that phrase again. Likewise, a ruler who is themselves ruled by feelings of immediate compassion is not always good news. The trouble with just being motivated by compassion is that it is often short-term and highly localized. Imagine that you are the ruler of a city and a man has been brought before you found guilty of conspiring against the citizenry and of defrauding public funds. He seems like a rather pitiful figure. He is dirty and his clothes are torn from his stay at the dungeons, and he falls at your feet, pleading for his life. He says he has a family, friends, people that depend on him. You would have to have a pretty hardened heart if that did not move you to compassion a little bit. I know it would certainly move me. But for Machiavelli, following a compassionate instinct here is only a short-term good. It may feel fantastic to have done a kind turn, and no doubt it will help you sleep more easily. But it also sends the message that conspiring against the state and defrauding the public treasury is something that you will tolerate. Given that there will be at least a few people of outsized ambition in your city, they are then more likely to use this route to enrich and empower themselves at the cost of everyone else. What seems like compassion is revealed to just be unwise, and as doing more people more harm in the long run. So, while I have almost certainly entitled this video something like "Why Good People Make Terrible Rulers," I would probably say Machiavelli's views are closer to good people make terrible rulers when they place their own short-term moral satisfaction over the needs of the state, endangering their people as a result, and ultimately showing more selfishness than the ruler who enacts temporary cruelty to secure long-term benefit for themselves and their citizens. But, that doesn't fit in the title box. However, next, I want to move on to particular instances of Machiavelli's highly controversial advice, starting with his notorious comments around honesty and dishonesty. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful backers on Patreon. The link is in the description. 4. Appearance, reality, and PR. Just as most people want a virtuous leader, most people also want an honest one. This makes an awful lot of sense, and it's a sentiment that I definitely share. After all, people want to know what their leader is up to, what the genuine state of their society is, and that promises will be kept as far as humanly possible. And in some ways, Machiavelli does sympathize with this idea. But he is also very clear that public appearance is often just as important as reality, both for the individual ruler and for the state as a whole. This point is made in detail by Kenneth Minogue, who argues that for Machiavelli, politics is just as much about interpretation as it is about facts. That is, given that each of us only has limited access to the genuine facts of the situation, it makes sense for a political leader to spin those facts to them and their people's advantage. For example, Machiavelli praises a particular Roman consul, Papirius, for turning a perceived bad omen to his advantage. The upcoming battle Papirius was about to fight looked like it was a certain victory for the Romans. Yet, one of their superstitions was that if a particular chicken did not eat before the battle, then fortune was not with them, and, as it happens, the chicken did not eat that fateful day. The leader of the chicken men, as Machiavelli calls them, lied and told the consul that the chickens did eat, but some of the other chicken men spread rumors of the true outcome of the omen among the troops, which just lowered morale. So, the consul came up with an ingenious solution to this public relations nightmare. He said that, from his end, the omens looked good, and that if he was lied to about the chicken, then this would surely fall on the head of the chief chicken man, and then he proceeded to place all of the chicken men on the front lines. When the chief chickeneer died in battle, the consul declared that if this was a liar who had been killed, then by that death, their army would have won back the favor of the gods. As a result, morale was restored and crisis was averted. Through a really quite clever scheme, Papirius ensured that whatever outcome happened, he would come out on top. If the chicken man survived, then the soldiers would believe the lie that the omens were in their favor and they would fight on. If the chicken men were killed, Papirius could give them this new story and they would also believe that the gods were on their side. Either way, he guarantees his success. In some ways, this is egregious dishonesty. It shows a total disregard for the truth. It is genius-level bullshitting. But it also won the Romans the battle. For Machiavelli, this art of manipulating perceptions is invaluable in military strategy, and not just when it comes to deceiving your opponents. If your forces are even remotely equal to your adversaries, Machiavelli thinks the outcome of battle will often be dictated by whoever's men fight harder and keep fighting for longer, and this, in turn, is often determined by morale and perception. He condemns a different Roman commander for throwing some other bad omen-given chickens into the sea, as this gave the impression of angering the gods even further. The actual auspices are just immaterial to him. The important thing is that they are framed in the appropriate way as to maximize the chances of victory. If he were ever questioned about the dishonesty of this, I imagine his rough response would be, look, do you want to win the battle or not? Which, to be fair, is not an unpersuasive argument when you are staring down a hostile force. We can also see this theme in how Machiavelli treats religion. Machiavelli's personal religious views are the matter of some debate, with some scholars seeing him as an unconventional Christian and some seeing him as an outright anti-Christian thinker. But, in his works, he is more often interested in religion as a cultural phenomenon than as a metaphysical or theological one. For example, in a way that prefigures Nietzsche's own critique, Machiavelli is concerned that Christianity teaches people to be too passive and contemplative rather than decisive, strong, and active. If you want a good book comparing and contrasting Nietzsche with Machiavelli, then Don Dembowski's Nietzsche's Machiavellian Politics is a great source. However, unlike Nietzsche, Machiavelli is no individualist and is largely interested in the ways religion can encourage people to set aside their temporary personal ambitions and bind themselves together as one unity in a citizen state. This is something Nietzsche, with his arch-individualism and philosophical elitism, would almost certainly despise. For example, Machiavelli praises much of the Roman superstitious and religious system because of how it encouraged people, even people who were individually powerful, to work for the good of the society as a whole. He states that the second Roman king, Numa, inculcated religion into the people of Rome to instill order and loyalty in the state, as well as to have supreme respect for the concept of an oath. So great was this cultural power that many men seemed more frightened of breaking a vow than they did losing their very lives. Machiavelli states that when the Carthaginian general Hannibal was rampaging through Italy and many Romans were thinking of fleeing, the commander Scipio revived Rome's chances by making these people swear oaths not to abandon their land in its hour of need. And they took these oaths so seriously that they did not, and Rome recovered. The piety of the Romans is not seen as good in and of itself, but rather Machiavelli thinks it promotes the kind of values that helped Rome succeed as a nation. Whatever his views on Christianity, Machiavelli definitely thought that the religions of ancient Rome were false. But he viewed them as effective, and in some ways, he saw that as more important. Again, we see that he is willing to tolerate dishonesty, provided it is in service to the state and its people. This also holds for his recommendation that rulers should promote themselves and ensure that they are seen as generous, powerful, wise, and just. This perception is good for stability and the perceived strength of the nation by others. It thus makes invasion and public disorder much less likely. By contrast, Machiavelli unequivocally condemns the kinds of dishonesty that he thinks weaken a nation. For example, in the Discourses, he repeatedly stresses the importance of honest counsel, arguing that this is one of the potential strengths a republic has over a principality. Whereas with an absolute ruler, there is often the worry that you could be punished if your advice leads to some failure. In a republic, this is much less often the case, provided that you don't insist on the advice in an extreme way and ignore others in the process. In The Prince, he recommends that even an authoritarian leader must bear honest and harsh truths from his advisors. They certainly should not punish the advisors for reporting failings or bringing them bad news, since this would simply ensure that the leader is not alerted to problems in the state that they might need to urgently attend to. It's now a trope in fiction for the rulers of evil empires to have their subordinates killed for bringing them some unfavorable report, but Machiavelli thinks this is setting them up for disaster. So, I'm terribly sorry, Darth Vader, you just wouldn't survive in Renaissance Italy. Machiavelli also prizes honesty in the judicial process, where he thinks that the appearance of fairness is paramount. And it's pretty hard to fake real fairness in the courts in a way that people don't pick up on. He argues that trying to bend the justice system to your personal will as a ruler will be seen through by almost everyone almost immediately. And this perception of unfairness will stoke hatred of you among your people. And if people can't trust the justice system to restore balance to the moral scales, they are much more likely to turn to vigilantism or personal blood vendettas, which will, in turn, greatly destabilize your state. Interestingly, contrary to his brutal reputation, Machiavelli quite often counsels leniency when dealing with failures in general, in order to keep people honest and focused on what really matters. For example, he strongly opposes punishing military commanders for failures on the battlefield. In his view, there is often too much chance involved in who wins a battle to lay it squarely at the feet of the general in command. What's worse, if you begin punishing commanders for losing battles, then the next commander will have that in the back of their minds when they're fighting, and this may affect their focus and subsequently their performance. A very extreme historical example of this from Chinese history is the military captain Chen Sheng. Realizing that he would be late leading his detachment of troops into position, and aware that the punishment for being late was death, he figured he had nothing to lose. He then led a rebellion that cost thousands of lives, and though it was defeated, it is thought by some scholars to have led to the eventual fall of the Qin dynasty. Another example is Li Bang, who actually did end the Qin dynasty when he accidentally let some prisoners escape who were in his keep. Since the punishment for this was also death, he also had nothing to lose and so revolted and eventually founded the Han dynasty. For Machiavelli, this was simply to be expected. If you punish people excessively for failure, all you do is stoke disorder and potentially compromise vital military decision-making. While that last example is not explicitly to do with the dishonesty of rulers, it illustrates an important point. Where clear-headed decision-making is needed, people must be able to speak frankly and honestly and be given the chance to fail in their efforts. Machiavelli thus subordinates both honesty and dishonesty to the service of the state and its people. In a whole host of cases, he does believe that honesty is the best policy. But since it's also good for a state's stability to see their leadership in a positive light, and for troops to have confidence in their potential for victory, dishonesty also has its place for the smooth running of a society. For Machiavelli, sometimes you do need to bend the facts for the good of all. But hang on a second. Isn't Machiavelli known for promoting ruthless dictatorships? Why is he now talking about the strengths of a republic? Well, despite what many people think, Machiavelli valued freedom extremely highly. But his views on it are very complex. And luckily, that is just our next point. 5. Freedom, security, and stability. If we accept that Machiavelli truly does desire what is good for the people of a state, then why did he write The Prince, which does often seem like a manual for dictators to seize and maintain power? Well, I would argue that two underlying aims dominate much of Machiavelli's advice, both in The Prince and elsewhere. The first is maintaining security, and the second is promoting freedom and self-governance wherever humanly possible. The trouble is that these two are often in tension, especially in non-republican states. For example, If you give citizens too much leeway, then you lose the unity of the state, and Machiavelli thinks that is inherently destabilizing. But he also has pretty good pragmatic reasons for prizing freedom in society more generally. For Machiavelli, free citizens fight harder for their country, are more invested in their government, and support their own state. By contrast, he thinks that dictators are far more fragile, since they provide a single position of near absolute power that people can compete over, and also quite often earn the justified resentment of their people. But then, what is all of that advice in The Prince about? Well, I think this is where Machiavelli's pragmatic nature comes into play. Machiavelli is strikingly unidealist in the way he approaches reality. He is determined to describe the world as he finds it, rather than how he wishes it were. And this practical spirit extends to the works themselves. The Prince is addressed directly to Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, who was, at that time, the ruler of Florence, Machiavelli's home state. Machiavelli himself lived in exile at that time, and on the whole had a rather dim view of the Medici family, what with them having imprisoned and tortured him not long before. The Prince thus serves partly as a bid to return to his city, and as a way to ingratiate himself with these new rulers. Considering Machiavelli's Republican leanings, this has led some to speculate that The Prince was actually an outright satire, designed to mock the very family it was dedicated to, and expose the evil ways that absolute rulers hold on to power. Personally, I think this goes too far in the other direction. Plenty of the contents of The Prince, such as the advice on citizen armies, on being decisive in punishing dissidents, and in earning the respect of the people, are mirrored in the discourses, which is definitely not satire. For me, I interpret The Prince as making the best of a bad situation. That is, if you do insist on being an absolute ruler, here's how you don't make a complete pig's ear of it and bring calamity on both yourself and the unfortunate people you govern. Viewed this way, the advice in The Prince actually fits quite nicely with a lot of his other works. We can even see Machiavelli attempting to fit ideas that are sympathetic to the common people being shoved in between the advice helpful to despots. For example, he thinks that, on the whole, a prince ought to leave ordinary people's customs, property, and family alone for the most part, as interfering with this will sow discontent and weaken the prince's position. Despite its reputation, most of the brutality in The Prince is directed at scheming nobles or powerful families rather than the common people. Part of this is because common people by themselves are thought to pose little to no threat to a dictator, or, if they're unified, Machiavelli simply thinks they're an overwhelming force. But I also suspect that Machiavelli's underlying sympathies for the common man are also heavily involved. Some scholars, like John McCormick, take this much further and argue that Machiavelli was a fundamentally democratic or populist figure, but I think this might go a bit far for me. Machiavelli's arguments for a government which involves ordinary people are often practical, and nowhere is this more evident than in his treatment of state security and stability. Throughout Machiavelli's works, the stability of the state is never far from his mind. Considering the time period, this makes perfect sense. Renaissance Italy was a hodgepodge of competing city-states who often invaded and outright conquered one another. There is every chance that should the stability of a state waver, that state would cease to exist in a pretty short time period. This concern with stability is behind a lot of his more authoritarian ideas, like that if you cannot be both loved and feared, it is better to be feared than loved. However, he also thinks this is where republics have enormous potential. Because whereas principalities, monarchies, and despotisms have to worry intensely about internal strife, republics have much less conflict between their citizens. In the Discourses, Machiavelli argues that without a carefully managed republic, there is a fundamental competition between the common people and the nobility. Broadly speaking, this is because the ordinary people want to be left alone, but the nobles wish to expand their power and so attempt to dominate the people. This is not necessarily because they are personally evil, but because there are other nobles attempting to dominate them, and so they must be constantly increasing their own personal strength in order that they aren't destroyed. Despite the fact that Machiavelli himself praises Sparta rather highly, I actually think they're a very good example of this internal conflict bringing instability. The Spartan state relied on a large population of slaves called helots to work their land. This allowed the Spartan citizens to focus on the art of war. something Machiavelli is a huge fan of, as we will see in the next section. However, this also meant that when the Spartan armies were on long campaigns, the Helots often revolted, which in turn limited the capability of the Spartan forces. In Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, he talks about how the Spartan commanders were often very nervous to be away from home too long, lest these Helots get restless. In Machiavelli's own time, he says that even the best monarchy around, the Kingdom of France, struggled because of this internal strife. The constant tension between the peasants and the nobles meant that the people could not be allowed too much freedom because they might revolt. But this also meant that the French state had to keep a tight military grip on their own nation. This was both just an expense and also limited their ability to mobilize their forces should they need to, and made them rely on mercenary armies. And we'll see why Machiavelli thinks that's an awful idea in the next section. The problem is that concerns about state security now ran directly against the freedom of the citizens, which created this intense class conflict. Essentially, this kept the nation in a constant, gentle war with itself. And as Abraham Lincoln once said, quoting the Gospels, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." As pointed out by Carrie Nederman and Tatiana Gomez, republics ideally solve this issue by giving everyone a seat at the table of government. Machiavelli carefully narrates how the Roman state came to have its different offices, a pair of executive consuls, a senate made up of nobles, and the tribunes of the plebs to represent the common people. In his mind, this rescued Rome from the destructive kind of internal conflict, because it ensured that each person felt like they were participating in the state. This became a virtuous cycle, since this also meant that the nobles and the consuls could trust ordinary citizens not to rebel, and as a result, they could have more freedom. At the same time, the tribunes kept watch on the excesses of the nobility. At least, that is the story as Machiavelli tells it. The goal is for all of the moving parts of the nation to be working together to achieve a definite aim. Of course, this is not a sort of modern liberal democracy, but instead balancing the interests of different aristocratic and non-aristocratic classes in the context of Renaissance Italy. However, it's also a far cry from dictatorship or tyranny. Machiavelli ultimately does desire free government, but he is not as concerned with the kind of freedoms that get a lot of press today, like freedom of speech or freedom to do what you want with your property. In fact, he often indicates that powerful citizens should be kept under careful watch to ensure that they're not plotting rebellions or coups. When he says free government, we should probably think of it as something like a government where the citizens participate to a large degree. Now, I don't want to overstate things here. For example, the large slave population of Rome gets very little mention in Machiavelli. But, on the whole, it is a very interesting way of viewing governmental systems. Machiavelli wants to maximize internal stability by safeguarding freedom and free participation in government. Effectively, he trusts that if people feel represented and invested in their state, then they are much less likely to stir trouble. This is all part of a general lesson in Machiavelli's works. If you want your state to succeed, you would do best to align the state's interests with the people's. As we said, Machiavelli thinks that if people identify with their state, they will fight harder, work harder, and fiercely defend the country against foes. Because in each case, they're not just fighting or working for some nebulous king or far-off set of nobles, but for their own freedom. He suggests this is one reason why the Roman Republic was so militarily successful. So we see that Machiavelli's arguments for republicanism are still eminently practical. It is not that he thinks it is inherently good for people to participate in government. If it was shown that monarchies are more effective after all and make better decisions, I'm sure he would change his mind. But he thinks that republics truly are the best form of state, simply based on the results they can achieve and the internal security they can generate. And, speaking of security, violence is absolutely crucial to understanding Machiavelli and his ideas. So, I think it is high time we take a look at it. 6. The need to be dangerous. A phrase I sometimes see battered around the internet is, "It is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war." It is intermittently attributed to Bruce Lee, the 17th century Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, and just an old proverb, sometimes said to be from China and sometimes Japan. I know this is a side tangent, but I spent so long trying to track down the origin of this quote, and I just can't find a definitive answer anywhere. But wherever this little aphorism comes from, its message is pretty clear. It is much better to be prepared for conflict and disorder, and for this to have turned out to be unnecessary, than to be unprepared, only for violence to then come knocking at your door. There is almost certainly something in this, but Machiavelli actually goes one step further. He thinks it is the duty of every state to be constantly ready for violence, since this not only means they will come out on top if war does break out, but also they are less likely to have to fight in the first place if they seem sufficiently dangerous. This has given Machiavelli something of a warmongering reputation, but I think things are far more complex than they first appear. Even those leaders Machiavelli does praise for their skills in other areas, such as Numa, who he says is a gifted administrator and cultural leader, he still criticizes for their lack of skill in combat. He even says that if Numa himself had not been succeeded by Pompilius, who was another warlike ruler, just like Romulus, then Rome would have probably fallen. On the other hand, if a leader is sufficiently skilled in battle, then Machiavelli thinks this can make up for a lot of other failings. For example, while Machiavelli condemns the ancient king of Syracuse, Agathocles, for being a criminal, a tyrant, and a brutal murderer, he states that none of this caused a fall from power, since he was such a skilled military commander, and even managed to win a number of victories against Carthage, which was a much larger state than Syracuse. Although Machiavelli says he's not to be admired, he also thinks you just can't argue with results. It goes to show just how important being a dangerous military leader is, that it could make up for all of these other shortcomings. He also praises the small German states who managed to maintain their independence in the face of much greater forces by ensuring that their towns are well fortified and that their armies continually practice their military exercises. The reason for this emphasis on military skill is simple. It is all well and good being the greatest domestic ruler in the world, but that will count for very little when a more powerful army marches through your city gates, plops your head on a pike, and brutalizes your citizens. Machiavelli's conception of geopolitics is incredibly dog eats dog. He thus thinks that every state should prioritize their military forces, no matter what their personal ambitions for expansion happen to be. Because for Machiavelli, sooner or later, no matter how peaceful or isolationist your state is, someone is going to knock on your door and demand something of you. They might want access to certain natural resources, or even request that you become their client state. It would be lovely if leaving everyone else alone was enough to excuse yourself from foreign policy. But Machiavelli thinks this is just naive. If you have anything worth taking, eventually someone will want to take it, and so you will have to defend it. And this is where military power is absolutely essential. There is simply no substitute for it. Thus, Machiavelli often recommends a state should pursue a subtle policy of expansion and aggression, not because this is a good thing in itself, but because the state must keep up with the power of the states around it. He's not an outright imperialist, but he does think that if you want to remain unconquered, you must be powerful enough to not be an easy target. Though this does not always require expansion. For instance, he thinks that Switzerland can rely on its fortifications and its geography to keep it secure. It does not need to acquire any new territories. And he also does advise expanding by diplomacy wherever possible, as this is a lot less risky. Machiavelli also desires a pretty aggressive form of foreign policy if conflict is looming. He suggests that once you know war is coming, you should enact it quickly and brutally, mobilizing all your forces and bringing it to a conclusion as swiftly as possible. Wars are an expensive, horrible business, and Machiavelli wants them to be as short as they can be. However, he also thinks that war should not be delayed if it's going to happen anyway. If you attack first, you can seize the initiative and hopefully catch your enemy unprepared. You also deny them the chance to build up their forces. The ideal for Machiavelli is to be ready for all-out war at any moment. This will both mean that any war you engage in will be brief and you will be likely to win it, and also that others will think twice before attacking you. He acknowledges that this will come at the cost of other things, but he just thinks it is well worth it. Machiavelli is also pretty skeptical of so-called allies in war. He saw them as fundamentally unreliable. When the chips are down, they have no reason to place your own interests over theirs, and nor should they. So, if you're ever backed into a corner, you can pretty much expect them to switch sides rather quickly. This does not always happen, but it happens often enough that it means total reliance on allies is just inadvisable. What if a new leader wants to suddenly break off the alliance? What if the ally becomes closer with one of your enemies? What if you are losing in battle and they switch sides? It's nice to have allies, sure, but Machiavelli says you definitely shouldn't rely on them too much. There is no substitute for having your own power. And for the record, Machiavelli also advises that you should break any alliances you have if they're going to bring your state to ruin. Remember, as a leader, your first duty is to your people, not to anyone else's. Or at least, that is his view. Likewise, Machiavelli deplored the Renaissance practice of relying on mercenary forces to fight your wars for you. Not only was this incredibly expensive, it was also placing the fate of your country in the hands of people just out for gold. This isn't the mercenaries' fault. They are honest and explicit about this. So Machiavelli is harshly critical of those who, knowing this unavoidable fact, depend largely on mercenary forces for their success. This was pretty close to his heart, since Florence employed mercenary forces far too readily in their armies, which, according to Tim Parks, were notorious for evaporating when things got tough. Instead, Machiavelli highly recommends that states should form their own citizen armies that are well-funded, well-trained, and well-led. This honestly comes across as a bit of a hobby horse because it comes up in almost every one of his major works. You can almost play Machiavelli bingo with it. You'll be reading about something unrelated, and all of a sudden, this issue of a citizen army will pop up. But despite this, it is incredibly sound advice. Machiavelli points out that a citizen army will be defending their homes, not just fighting for a paycheck. And if they live in a republic, then they will hopefully identify and be invested in their own country. Again, we see why Machiavelli is so enthusiastic about citizen participation in a state. It means that they will fight harder for that state, bringing them even more successes. When it comes to victory in war, Machiavelli presents two options. On the one hand, you can be incredibly magnanimous. You can attempt to make your defeated foe your friend and ensure that whoever controls the city is on your side in the future. On the other, you can destroy the leadership of the state entirely and ensure that they can never rise to threaten you again. This is also how he thinks you should deal with enemies more generally. Either make them your friend and secure their support, or make it so they will never have the chance to bite you back in the future. The middle path, where you punish your enemies just enough that they resent you, but leave them with the ability to gather their strength and punish you for it, is to be avoided at all costs. This idea is behind the rather cold-hearted recommendation to kill the ruling family of a state if you conquer them, to ensure that there are none left for resistors to rally around. One historical example of someone making the middle way mistake is the terms given to Carthage by Rome at the end of the First Punic War. They extracted wealth and resources from the defeated Carthaginians, but gave them enough autonomy to eventually recoup their power. This culminated in Hannibal's famous campaign across Italy, where he killed hundreds of thousands of Roman troops and nearly brought Rome to its knees. However, the Romans did not repeat this mistake, eventually destroying Carthage completely after the Third Punic War, and it was never a problem again. Machiavelli's focus on war and violence is another thing that's earned him the devious reputation he enjoys today. But again, I think it's important to see this in context. Machiavelli does not revel in violence for violence's sake. He just thinks that war is sometimes inevitable and that when it happens, it is better to commit to it wholeheartedly than to half-ass things and ensure that the conflict drags on for years. Of course, this is just Machiavelli's view, and other military tacticians would no doubt disagree. To use another example from the Punic Wars, the Roman consul Fabius deliberately dragged out the conflict with Hannibal, knowing that he could not defeat him in open battle, but that internal tensions in Hannibal's forces would eventually weaken him. Though, of course, the ultimate death blow to Hannibal was delivered in another way. I largely want to note that, unlike some others, Machiavelli does not glorify military might as an end in itself, but rather as something leaders must have to ensure the security and prosperity of their nation. Likewise, his brutal advice for treating defeated foes was not because he loved the idea of executing enemies mercilessly, but because he thought the alternative would lead to more conflict and ultimately cost more lives. The lesser of two evils can still look pretty ugly. But next, I want to turn to the main reason I think Machiavelli is seen as such a dastardly and untrustworthy figure, and what this can teach us about the function and potential value of principles. 7. Princes, principles, and prudence. When we call something Machiavellian, we don't just mean that it's evil. Take someone like Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, in both the TV show and the books. He is often scheming, manipulative, and cunning. But he's also not straightforwardly a bad guy. His superior political maneuvering even saves the city of King's Landing. He is, in some ways, a classic Machiavellian character displaying classic Machiavellian behavior, even though we're still reluctant to call him Machiavellian because while it's not synonymous with evil, it does tend to only get used with evil-seeming characters. But if you asked me why people see Machiavelli's style of politics as evil, I would say it comes down to his willingness to abandon absolute moral principles and remain pragmatic in his judgments, even if that pragmatism is ultimately in service to the greater good of the people. This lack of lines in the sand that somebody just will not cross, no matter the circumstances, understandably makes people suspicious and nervous. One thing Machiavelli emphasizes over and over again in his writings is the importance of contextual factors to decision-making. Even his own advice is only meant to give general guidelines, and he suggests that leaders should use their own practical wisdom and experience to overrule it when necessary. For example, while he does advise that war should not be delayed since the aggressor has an advantage, they can seize the initiative, he also states that there are important exceptions, such as if you're in no position to currently wage war, or if your homeland is particularly well-suited to defense. If your city is on top of a mountain, then it just makes no sense to pursue aggressive military strategy since you're incredibly hard to conquer. In itself, I don't think people mind this. We all know someone who sticks doggedly to how they've always done things long after it becomes unhelpful. But people tend to get uncomfortable when this is extended to moral principles as well. Whenever Machiavelli recommends some ethical rule, it always comes with a but attached. Honor alliances, but only when they're helpful to you. Support another friendly state in a conflict, but potentially with an eye to weaken them or make them dependent on you. Be a just ruler who follows the laws of the land, but also do award honors to secure your power and the power of the state. Be honest with the people, since there can be wisdom in the general consensus of the masses. But also, do deceive them if you think it will make them better citizens. While Machiavelli gives some pretty solid advice, and oftentimes it even coheres with intuitive morality, ultimately, he serves only one master: what works. And, understandably, people are pretty skeptical of this intensely pragmatic approach. Take the first leader of Republican Rome, the fantastically named Lucius Junius Brutus. Machiavelli specifically praises Brutus for executing his own sons, since they conspired against the new state, and he even publicly went to watch their execution. For a lot of people, especially those in the ancient world, this betrays a dearly held moral principle: to value and respect your family and to be loyal towards them. But Machiavelli recognized that without this brutal punishment and the show of support by the new leader of the Republic, the budding state would have probably fallen into chaos. Likewise, we tend to prize the right to a fair trial. So when Machiavelli recommends that defeated enemies should be put to death swiftly if they can't be made into allies, it goes against a principle that is very close to our hearts. Machiavelli might even sympathize with our concern, given that he too broadly desires a fair and honest judicial system. But he would also argue there are exceptions to every rule, and if you allow these people to live for very long, it will give them a chance to destabilize the state further. In this way, Machiavelli is fundamentally at odds with how we often conceive of politics today, which is heavily influenced by ideas about individual rights and individual liberties. We tend to think that someone's rights should not be violated even in desperate times. No matter what happens, we don't want people detained indefinitely without trial or executed on the spot, or to be deceived by our own governments. But, in principle, Machiavelli thinks that all of these things are justifiable given the right circumstances. This is a natural conclusion of his state-relative consequentialism. If it is in the best long-term interests of the state and its people to suspend a moral rule, then that rule must be suspended. Nothing is sacred. And if the situation is dire enough, then every single ethical law can and will be broken. This idea, very understandably, makes people anxious. Despite Machiavelli's concern for balancing the different powers in a state, this priority given to consequences can make people suspicious of what their government will do to them if suddenly some heinous action is seen as in the interests of the people. After all, this very excuse has been used by dictators and despots throughout the world and throughout history to justify horrendous actions that not only violated legal rights and protections, but weren't even in the interests of the people anyway. It also may make other states much more nervous about becoming your ally. If you have the choice between allying with someone who will have your back to the bitter end and someone you know will only support you when they judge it is in their best interests, then you would go with the more principled ally almost every time. Of course, Machiavelli would respond by saying that a leader ought to ensure that they are perceived as principled, while secretly being this people-serving pragmatist in the background. As Machiavelli himself puts it while discussing leaders who break their promises, the crowd is won over by appearances and final results. That is, as long as you can appear like you are serving a set of moral rules and your decisions ultimately benefit the people as a whole, then you will not be condemned for your ethical flexibility, but praised for it. But then, this raises its own problems. Because this strategy might be all well and good if only the ruler or rulers know about it, but as soon as it becomes clear that this is their strategy, people will become suspicious again. If people know that their leaders are striving for the appearance of principles rather than principles themselves, then they'll ask the very sensible question: how do I know that you are really acting in the interests of the people? This puts the leader in a bind. They must behave in a Machiavellian way, yet conceal that Machiavellianism from their people. But this also creates a pretty significant internal tension in his philosophy. If he wishes the citizens to freely participate in government, how can he have a wall of deception keeping the leaders of a state from being transparent with those citizens? I think this is a genuine conundrum in Machiavelli's works, and one that I have not found a definitive resolution to. I also suspect that this is largely what rubs people up the wrong way when they're reading Machiavelli. Even when the myths about him supporting despotism are dispelled and he is revealed to want republican governance by an engaged populace, we are still suspicious of the recommendation to abandon principles whenever they become inconvenient. Because if our leaders have shown that they can do that skillfully and ably when working in our interests, who is to say that they cannot also do that when they are out for themselves, all the while pulling the wool over our eyes using the exact same tricks with which they have deceived our enemies? I wanted to draw attention to this point because I think it represents both what many people find so appealing about Machiavelli, but also what strikes some as deeply disturbing. A leader who follows Machiavelli's advice and is open about it may be pretty effective, but they will also seem incredibly unpredictable and thus untrustworthy. There is something freeing about being liberated from the constraints of moral rules and simply acting for the good of the people, but many are understandably skeptical about whether we can justify that call. Isn't the whole reason we have moral laws that we are not that skilled at judging when a principle ought to be broken for the greater good, so we're just better off sticking to these prior commandments? I also think this serves as a nice counterpoint to some of what we have already said about Machiavelli. When most people start to read Machiavelli, they think he is a bastard. Then, when some misconceptions are cleared up, it is easy to go to the other extreme and start to build an idealistic picture of him and what he believes. In the past, I've spoken about this phenomenon when it comes to Nietzsche, where people sometimes oscillate between believing in monster Nietzsche and fluffy bunny Nietzsche, all the while leading more moderate interpretations of him completely untouched. In the same way, we should beware of fluffy bunny Machiavelli just as we should avoid dictator Machiavelli. And for our final section, I want to emphasize this point. What is Machiavelli's true legacy, and how should we approach him when reading his work today? 8. Machiavelli in the modern age. Niccolo Machiavelli has achieved a coveted position among great thinkers. He gets people excited. There are not many philosophers people want to know this much about. He seems dark, mysterious, and a guardian of forbidden knowledge. His pragmatism goes against every moral lesson we have ever been taught, and yet he claims it is for the greater good. It is unsurprising people find this kind of thing appealing and alluring. Normally, I end these longer videos by explaining why I think you should check out this particular book or thinker, but Machiavelli does not require that sort of pitch. So instead, I wanted to look at how to read him and what general lessons he can provide us today. The first thing to bear in mind is that Machiavelli is always writing in the context of Renaissance Italy, and he always has his own ends in sight. Sometimes those ends are personal, like wanting to return to Florence, and sometimes they are ideological, like wanting to make a positive case for republicanism or do the history of his home country justice. Then there are his overarching goals. He wants to see Italy unified, for example. Whereas Machiavelli's recommendations sometimes do seem timeless, it is important to not just take him at his word and consider that occasionally circumstances might have changed. For example, in one notorious passage in The Art of War, he predicts that firearms just won't be all that important on the battlefield. That may have been true for him, but I think it's fair to say that the situation has changed in the intervening 500 years. Machiavelli is also remarkable in his refusal to systematize. Despite there being certain consistent through lines in his work, he never sits down and defines a final system for how politics is to be done, and he probably would find this impossible. It's just too variable. In this way, he does remind me of Nietzsche, who also spurns systematic philosophy in favor of a series of observations, some of which are connected, but many of which just stand alone. However, given all these qualifications, many of Machiavelli's insights remain intensely relevant or interesting to us in the modern day, whether we are in politics or not. Firstly, Machiavelli is something of a practical pessimist. That is, he always recommends planning for the worst possible scenario. He thinks that a leader should assume that everyone is ambitious and selfish, because if they don't, they will be unprepared for the ones that are ambitious and selfish. He thinks that a nation should always be ready for war, because otherwise, if war does come, they will be stuffed. He advises totally destroying defeated enemies, because even if only a few are left to build up their power, they may eventually destroy you. He wants a leader to be brutally pragmatic, because if they're not, it will put them at a disadvantage against those who are. And sometimes it only takes a single crushing defeat to do away with a whole state or even a whole dynasty. In some ways, Machiavelli is a deeply hopeful thinker, ambitious about what he believes humanity and governments could be. But he also knows that thinking they are like this already is a fool's game, and will shortly be a dead fool's game. Additionally, Machiavelli asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world. He ensures we question whether our moral principles actually achieve what we claim they do, and whether we should leave them aside occasionally to accomplish some greater good. He prevents us from clinging to an ironclad morality as a way to keep our own soul clean while we serve some greater evil in the long run. As I have emphasized again and again, Machiavelli is the master of picking the lesser of two evils and of committing short-term cruelty for long-term kindness. Machiavelli was a Republican, but not a particularly idealistic one. He wanted people to have a say in their own government, But he also thought that republics would remain stable and prosperous by making their citizens more loyal and more united, even if that meant lying to them. He saw education as the way to achieve this, and culture and religion as the way to cement it. In his view, to change a people, you must change what they considered virtuous. Yet, at the same time, he thought a ruler ought to be aware enough to discard these virtues when they needed to. This arguably mixes citizen rule with a certain paternalism. But he thought that in theory, this could get you all the decisiveness of an authoritarian government with all of the loyalty and reliability of a republican one. This mixture of idealism and harsh realism is fascinating, and it's certainly worth considering how we balance these factors when we're crafting our own philosophy. Machiavelli despised tyrannical rule because he thought it gave the worst of all worlds. It made the state so divided that it became unstable, and it made the citizenry miserable, which would eventually cause it to collapse. His critiques of tyrants sometimes seem unfamiliar because they attack the institution from a practical angle. For Machiavelli, more important than tyrannies being immoral is the fact that they just don't work. And this obsession with what works practically in the here and now pervades Machiavelli's thought. For him, you can sit around writing all of the treatises on virtue that you want, but if you can't achieve and hold on to power, you may as well burn them. Likewise, you can be the morally perfect king, but if this brings about the ruin of you and your people, then what was the point? Machiavelli's advice is not so that evil people can wreak their horrid designs upon the world, but so that those who truly have the people's best interest at heart can endure, survive, and prosper in a world of unscrupulous, self-centered, and avaricious foes. It is to teach good rulers to be just wicked enough that they do not fall prey to the serpents of the world, and know how to use the tricks of the evil against the evil for the benefit of their own citizens. That last part is crucial, because all of Machiavelli's works display a deep concern with the people of a nation. He thinks we all have a duty to safeguard, shelter, and protect our societies, and to work together for the good of all within those societies. Whenever he recommends that someone does something seemingly immoral, it is almost always because he thinks it will serve their people in the long term. It is the end that everything else works towards. The ruler's job is to take on the necessary sins of government personally, sacrificing even their conscience for the common good. For Machiavelli, a leader should treat their citizens like family, both in the animalistic tribal sense of preferring their well-being to anyone else's, but also in the more noble sense of putting them first in all decisions and protecting them at all costs. So, perhaps we ought to revise our definition of Machiavellian. Rather than referring to a selfish, untrustworthy, amoral schemer, maybe it should mean someone who is willing to give up anything, even their personal morality, if it will prevent the destruction of their community and promote the well-being of the people in their care. Machiavelli does not have a universal ethical system that involves everyone. In this way, he is still very much in conflict with most modern moralities. But there is nothing he holds in greater contempt than a ruler simply out for themselves. So, let's not write off this Florentine politician as a mere teacher of evil, but instead see him for what he is, a unique thinker with unique concerns who just does not play nicely with any form of modern ethics, but also has much to teach us from his many years of hard study and dedicated service, as long as we keep a critical eye to where we may disagree with him. But if you want a complete contrast to Machiavelli's views, then check out this video to learn about Dostoevsky's phenomenal novel The Idiot, how one man's moral system brought destruction to those around him, and whether it was all worth it. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.